You are on HOA debrief. The tow hook was inches away. Sharon waved the tow truck remote control over her head like it was a scepter and yelled that the barcode sticker scan result said tow, and she trusted the scan more than my paperwork. You picked the wrong corner to cut, she said, her voice cutting through the gray Tacoma afternoon like a saw blade. I stood next to my car with my work shirt still smelling like diesel and fork grease because I had just clocked out from my warehouse forklift lead shift, and I could not afford to miss the overtime pay that kept my rent stable. Eagle Ridge Terrace Association was printed on every sign in this neighborhood, and Sharon Nelson was the community standards chair who turned vague guidelines into personal vendettas. I moved here 3 weeks ago because the rent was reasonable and the place looked quiet. I work nights at a distribution center and I need to park close so I can get in and out fast when my shift rotates. Sharon pointed at the tire chalk mark near my front sidewall and said it proved I had been parked for more than the allowed 2 hours in guest parking. I told her I live here and I have a resident decal on my windshield. She said the decal was not registered properly because I had not attended the mandatory new resident orientation, and the scan confirmed my plate was flagged. Her voice went up another notch, and she said this conversation is not a debate, it is a directive. I asked her to show me the rule in writing. She said your paperwork is cute, mine has a letterhead, and she held up a clipboard with Eagle Ridge Terrace printed at the top in bold without showing me the actual text. A couple sitting on their porch across the street watched us like we were a reality show. Sharon turned and waved at the tow truck idling at the curb, and the driver leaned out his window. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Sharon said recording was a violation of community privacy standards and I was creating a hostile environment. I said I was standing on a public street and she was threatening to tow my car without cause. She said the cause was written in the violation notice that had been placed on my windshield yesterday, and I had ignored it. I told her I never saw a notice. She said ignorance was not an excuse, and she held the remote up again like she was about to press the button. I glanced at my phone. I had a medical appointment scheduled in 2 hours for a follow-up that took months to book, and if I missed it, I would have to wait another 4 months to reschedule. Sharon saw me check the time and smiled. She said if I did not move the car immediately, she would authorize the tow, and I would spend the rest of the day dealing with the tow yard. I asked her what rule I violated. She said guest parking was limited to 2 hours and enforcement was active from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. I said I was not a guest, I was a resident. She said my decal was not valid because I had not completed orientation, and the system flagged me as a non-compliant resident, which meant I defaulted to guest rules. The tow driver climbed out of his truck and walked over with a clipboard. Sharon handed him a sheet of paper and he nodded. I said I wanted to see the authorization. He said the HOA had a standing contract and he did not need my permission. I asked for his company name and license number. He rattled off a name I did not catch and pointed at the decal on his truck door. Sharon said the tow was happening whether I cooperated or not, and if I interfered, she would call the police and report me for obstruction. I stepped back and kept recording. The driver hooked the chains under my rear axle and started the lift. I called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher said they would send an officer, but it could take 30 minutes. Sharon said 30 minutes was plenty of time for the truck to be gone, and I would have to go to the tow yard on Pacific Avenue to get it back. She said the fees started at $250 plus daily storage. I asked her how she got the authority to authorize a tow without giving me notice or a chance to move. She said the notice was on my windshield yesterday and the 2-hour grace period expired this morning. I said I parked here last night after my shift and there was no notice. She said I must have removed it or it blew away, and either way the enforcement clock started when the chalk mark was applied. The driver finished securing the chains and climbed back into the cab. Sharon turned to me and said this was a lesson in following community standards, and if I had attended orientation I would have known the rules. I said I was never notified about an orientation. She said the orientation schedule was posted on the resident portal and it was my responsibility to check it. I asked for the portal login. She said it was sent to my email when I signed the lease. I pulled up my email and scrolled through every message from the property management company, and there was nothing about a portal or an orientation. Sharon said she was not going to stand here and argue with someone who refused to take responsibility. She walked toward the tow truck, and the driver started the engine. I called out and said I would file a complaint with the city. She stopped and turned around. She said the city had no jurisdiction over HOA enforcement, and if I filed a frivolous complaint, she would add it to my violation file, and it could affect my lease renewal. I said that sounded like retaliation. She said it was consequences for non-compliance, and if I wanted to escalate, she was happy to take it to the board. The tow truck pulled away from the curb with my car dangling from the lift. I stood there with my phone still recording and my hands shaking because I knew I was about to miss my appointment, and I had no way to get across town in time. Sharon walked past me and said she hoped this taught me to respect the process. I asked her what process. She said the process of living in a managed community where standards existed for a reason. I said the reason seemed to be giving her an excuse to harass people. She said if I continued to use inflammatory language, she would document it as a hostile interaction and it could be grounds for a lease violation. I walked back to my apartment and sat down at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop and started searching for the Eagle Ridge Terrace Association rules. The property management website had a PDF labeled Community Guidelines, but it was only 3 pages and it said nothing about guest parking time limits or decal registration or mandatory orientation. I called the management office and got voicemail. I left a message asking for clarification on the parking rules and a copy of the violation notice Sharon claimed was on my windshield. I called the tow yard. The woman who answered said my car was logged in and the release fee was $250 plus a $50 administrative fee plus $25 per day storage starting tomorrow. I said the tow was not legitimate. She said I needed to take that up with the HOA because they authorized it. I asked for a receipt showing the authorization. She said she would email it to me. I gave her my email, and she said it would take up to 2 business days. I said I needed my car today. She said I could pay the fees and get it released and then dispute the charges with the HOA afterward. I did not have $300 to throw away on a bogus tow. I called my bank and checked my balance. I had enough to cover the fees, but it would wipe out the buffer I kept for emergencies. I sat there staring at my phone and trying to figure out my next move. I needed to get to the tow yard, pay the ransom, and then start building a case to get the money back. I also needed to figure out how Sharon got the authority to do this, and whether the HOA had any actual rules or if she was just making them up as she went. I grabbed my wallet and my keys and walked out to the street. A neighbor I had not met yet was getting out of his truck, and I asked if he knew anything about the parking rules. He said Sharon had been cracking down on guest parking for the past month, and she had towed at least 4 cars that he knew of. He said most people just paid the fees because fighting the HOA was a nightmare. I asked if anyone had pushed back. He said one guy tried and Sharon got him hit with a bunch of fines for other violations, like lawn height and trash can placement, and he eventually moved out. I called a rideshare and waited at the curb. The driver showed up 10 minutes later and I gave him the address for the tow yard. He said he picked up a lot of fares going there and the company had a reputation for aggressive towing. I asked if he knew anything about Eagle Ridge Terrace. He said he had heard the HOA was strict, but he did not know details. I sat in the back seat and pulled up the county property records website on my phone. I searched for Eagle Ridge Terrace Association and found a list of board members. Sharon Nelson was listed as Community Standards Chair. The board president was a man named Gerald Hicks. I wrote down his name and kept scrolling. The rideshare dropped me off at the tow yard. I walked into the office and the woman at the counter asked for my name and vehicle information. I gave her my license and she pulled up the record on her computer. She said the total was $305. I asked for a breakdown. She said $250 for the tow, $50 for the administrative fee, and $5 for gate access. I said gate access was not mentioned on the phone. She said it was a standard charge. I asked for a receipt showing the HOA authorization. She printed a sheet that had Eagle Ridge Terrace Association at the top and Sharon Nelson's name as the authorizing party. The timestamp said the authorization was issued at 1:15 in the afternoon, which was 20 minutes before Sharon showed up at my car. I asked how the authorization could be issued before the violation was confirmed. The woman said the HOA had a standing TOW on-site agreement for certain violations, and the authorization was pre-approved based on the plate scan. I asked to see the scan record. She said that was proprietary information and I would need to request it from the HOA. I paid the fees and she handed me a release form. I walked out to the impound lot and found my car. The tire chalk mark was still visible on the sidewall. I took pictures of the mark, the car, and the receipt. I drove back to Eagle Ridge Terrace and parked in the same spot. I wanted to see how long it would take before Sharon showed up again. I sat in my car and opened the Community Guidelines PDF on my phone. I read through it 3 times and there was still no mention of guest parking time limits. The only parking rule was that residents were required to display a valid decal and guests were required to use designated guest spaces. My spot was not marked as guest parking. It was on the street in front of my building and there were no signs indicating time limits or restrictions. I got out of my car and walked around the neighborhood. I counted 6 different types of parking signs. Some said resident parking only. Some said guest parking with no time limit listed. Some said no parking between 2 and 6 in the morning for street cleaning. None of them matched what Sharon had told me. I took pictures of every sign I saw. I also noticed that several cars parked in guest spaces had no decals at all, and some had been there for days based on the dust and leaves piled on the hoods. I went back to my apartment and started drafting an email to the property management company. I attached the pictures of the signs, the tow receipt, and the authorization document. I explained that I was towed without proper notice and the rules Sharon cited did not appear in the community guidelines. I asked for a refund of the tow fees and clarification on the parking rules. I sent the email and copied Sharon and the board president. 2 hours later, I got a reply from Sharon. She said my email was inappropriate and accusatory and I needed to follow the proper complaint procedure, which involved submitting a written request to the board and waiting for the next monthly meeting. She said the meeting was 3 weeks away and I would be notified of the date and time. She also said my tone violated the Community Standards Code of Conduct, and if I continued to send hostile emails, she would recommend the board take action against my lease. I replied and asked what specific language in my email was hostile. She did not respond. I called the property management company again, and this time I got a person. I explained the situation and asked if the HOA had the authority to tow without notice. The woman said the HOA was a separate entity and the management company did not oversee enforcement actions. I asked who did oversee them. She said the board was self-governing and disputes had to be handled through the board process. I asked if there was anyone else I could escalate to. She said I could consult an attorney, but most lease agreements included a binding arbitration clause for HOA disputes. I hung up and pulled out my lease. I flipped to the back and found the arbitration clause. It said any dispute with the HOA had to go through mediation before filing a lawsuit, and the mediator had to be approved by both parties. I called a tenant rights hotline and explained the situation. The advocate said HOAs in Washington had broad authority, but they were still required to follow their own rules and provide proper notice before enforcement actions. She said I should request a copy of the HOA bylaws and meeting minutes and look for any records of rule changes or enforcement policies. She also said I should file a complaint with the city if the tow company violated any municipal codes. I spent the next 2 days digging. I went to the city clerk's office and asked how to request HOA documents. The clerk, a woman named Angela, said HOA bylaws and meeting minutes were considered public records if the HOA was incorporated and I could file a public records request. She walked me through the process and I submitted the request that afternoon. Angela said it could take up to 30 days for a response, but most HOAs replied within a week. While I waited, I started keeping a log. Every time I parked, I took pictures with timestamps. I also started talking to other residents. A woman named Lisa, who lived 2 buildings over, said Sharon had been targeting her for months over her kids' bikes being left in the common area. Lisa said Sharon filed a formal complaint and the board fined her $50. Lisa paid it because she did not want the hassle, but she said the rule Sharon cited was not in the guidelines, and she suspected Sharon was adding rules without board approval. Another neighbor named Marcus said he got a violation notice for parking his work van on the street overnight. The notice said commercial vehicles were prohibited, but Marcus checked the bylaws and there was no such rule. He ignored the notice, and Sharon escalated it to a formal hearing. Marcus said he showed up with a printed copy of the bylaws, and Sharon claimed there was an updated version that had not been posted yet. The board sided with Sharon and fined him $100. Marcus said he moved out 2 months later because the harassment was constant. I asked Marcus if he kept any records from the hearing. He said he had emails and a copy of the hearing notice. I asked if I could see them. He said he would dig them up and send them to me. That night he emailed me a folder with 15 documents, including the original bylaws, the violation notices, and a recording of the hearing. I listened to the recording and heard Sharon say the updated bylaws were approved at the last board meeting, but they were not published yet because they were waiting for the attorney to finalize the language. I cross-referenced the hearing date with the board meeting minutes I found online. The minutes said the board discussed parking enforcement, but there was no mention of a vote to update the bylaws. I made a note and kept digging. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more neighborhood drama where paper trails win. A week later, I got a response to my public records request. The city clerk sent me a link to download the HOA bylaws, meeting minutes for the past 2 years, and the enforcement policy manual. I opened the enforcement policy manual first. It was 20 pages long, and it outlined the process for issuing violations, conducting hearings, and imposing fines. The section on parking said residents had to display a valid decal, and guests were limited to 72 hours in guest parking spaces. There was no mention of 2-hour limits or tow on-site agreements. I opened the meeting minutes and started reading. The most recent minutes were from 2 months ago. The board discussed budgets, landscaping contracts, and a complaint about noise from the pool area. There was no discussion of parking enforcement changes. I scrolled back through older minutes and found a pattern. Every few months, Sharon would bring up a parking issue, and the board would authorize her to send warning letters. There was never a vote to change the bylaws or add new restrictions. I kept reading and found something interesting. 6 months ago, the board voted to approve a contract with a towing company called Summit Towing and Recovery. The contract included a clause that gave the tow company exclusive rights to all HOA tows and paid the HOA a $50 referral fee for every tow. I pulled up the tow receipt from my car and checked the company name. Summit Towing and Recovery. I drafted another email to the board. I attached the enforcement policy manual, the meeting minutes, and the tow receipt. I pointed out that the 2-hour rule Sharon cited was not in any official document, and the tow company had a financial relationship with the HOA that created a conflict of interest. I asked for a full refund of the tow fees and a clarification on what parking rules were actually in effect. I sent the email and copied Sharon, the board president, and the property management company. Sharon replied within an hour. She said my email was full of inaccuracies and I was misrepresenting the board's decisions. She said the 2-hour rule was part of the guest parking guidelines that were distributed at orientation, and failure to attend orientation did not exempt me from the rules. She also said the towing contract was approved by the board and there was no conflict of interest because the referral fee was used to fund community improvements. She said if I continued to make false accusations, she would recommend the board pursue legal action against me for defamation. I replied and asked for a copy of the guest parking guidelines she mentioned. She did not respond. I called the property management company again and asked if they had a copy of the orientation materials. The woman said she would check and get back to me. She called me the next day and said there was no record of orientation materials being distributed to new residents. She said orientation was optional and the only requirement was reading the community guidelines posted online. I printed out the email chain and added it to my file. I also started looking into Summit Towing and Recovery. I searched the company name on the Washington State Department of Licensing website and found their tow truck operator license. I clicked through to their complaint history and found 3 formal complaints filed in the past year. 2 were for towing vehicles without proper authorization, and 1 was for refusing to release a vehicle after the owner paid the fees. All 3 complaints were under investigation. I called the Department of Licensing and asked how to file a complaint. The representative said I needed to submit a written statement with supporting documents, and they would investigate. I asked how long it took. She said most investigations took 60 to 90 days. I said I needed something faster because the HOA was threatening more enforcement actions. She said I could also file a complaint with the city police if the tow violated any municipal codes. I called the Tacoma Police non-emergency line and explained the situation. The dispatcher said an officer would call me back. 2 hours later, Officer Ramirez called. I walked him through the timeline and sent him copies of the tow receipt, the authorization, and the enforcement policy manual. He said the tow company was required to verify authorization before towing, and if the HOA did not follow their own rules, the tow could be considered improper. He said I should file a formal complaint with the police, and he would follow up with the tow company. I filed the complaint, and Officer Ramirez said he would contact Summit Towing and request their records. He also said he would reach out to the HOA and ask for documentation of the rules Sharon cited. I thanked him and hung up. I felt like I was finally getting somewhere, but I knew Sharon was not going to back down without a fight. The next day, I got an email from the board president, Gerald Hicks. He said the board had reviewed my complaint and determined that Sharon acted within her authority as Community Standards Chair. He said the parking enforcement was consistent with the HOA's mission to maintain property values and ensure resident safety. He also said the board stood by the towing contract and there was no conflict of interest. He said if I wanted to appeal the decision, I could request a hearing at the next board meeting. I replied and said I would attend the meeting. Gerald sent me the date and time. The meeting was 2 weeks away. I marked it on my calendar and kept building my case. I also started noticing something strange. Every time I parked on the street, Sharon would show up within an hour and walk around my car taking pictures. She never said anything to me, but I could see her through my window holding her phone and snapping shots of my license plate, my decal, and the tire chalk mark she kept reapplying. One afternoon, I was walking to my car and I saw Sharon talking to a man in a Summit towing truck. She handed him a sheet of paper and he nodded. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Sharon saw me and walked over. She said I was harassing her by recording without consent. I said I was on a public street and she was conducting HOA business in the open. She said she was going to file a complaint with the board. I said I was going to send the video to the police. She turned and walked away. That night I got an email from Sharon. The subject line said final warning. The body of the email said I had violated multiple community standards, including hostile communication, unauthorized recording, and failure to comply with parking enforcement. She said the board was considering terminating my lease, and I had 5 days to respond in writing. I forwarded the email to Officer Ramirez and asked if the threat was legal. He said lease termination required proper notice and cause, and the HOA could not terminate based on retaliation. He said I should respond in writing and document everything. I drafted a response. I said I had not violated any rules, the parking enforcement was not supported by the bylaws, and the threat to terminate my lease was retaliation for filing a complaint. I attached every document I had collected, including the enforcement policy manual, the meeting minutes, the tow receipts, and the police complaint. I sent the email to Sharon, Gerald, and the property management company. I also sent a copy to Angela at the city clerk's office and asked if there was anything else I could do. Angela called me the next day. She said she had been following my case and she noticed something odd in the meeting minutes I sent her. She said the minutes from the board meeting where the towing contract was approved had been amended 3 weeks after the meeting. The original version said the board discussed the contract and tabled the vote. The amended version said the board approved the contract. Angela said amendments were allowed, but they had to be documented, and the original version had to be preserved. She said if the HOA altered the minutes without proper documentation, it could be a violation of the Open Public Meetings Act. I asked Angela how I could prove the minutes were altered. She said she kept copies of all public records requests and she could pull the original version if I filed a follow-up request. I filed the request immediately. Angela said she would expedite it and get me the documents within a few days. I thanked her and hung up. I acted like I was backing down, because timing was the whole weapon. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night at 7. I showed up at 6:45 and the meeting room was already packed. I recognized Marcus and Lisa and a few other residents I had talked to. Sharon was sitting at the front table with Gerald and 2 other board members. She had her key ring with too many keys sitting on the table in front of her, and she kept jingling them while she talked to Gerald. The meeting started, and Gerald went through the agenda. Budget updates, landscaping bids, pool maintenance. 30 minutes in, he said they would hear resident concerns. I raised my hand and Gerald called on me. I stood up and said I wanted to address the parking enforcement issue. Sharon immediately interrupted and said I had already submitted a written complaint and the board had responded. I said I had new information. Sharon said the board was not obligated to hear repetitive complaints. Gerald said he would allow me to speak for 5 minutes. I pulled out my folder and started walking through the timeline. I showed the enforcement policy manual and pointed out that the 2-hour rule did not exist. I showed the TOW receipt and explained the financial relationship between the HOA and Summit Towing. I showed the meeting minutes and explained that the contract vote was not documented in the original version. Sharon stood up and said I was making false accusations. Gerald told her to sit down. I kept going. I said I had filed a public records request and received 2 versions of the meeting minutes. I held up both copies. The original version said the board discussed the towing contract and tabled the vote. The amended version said the board approved the contract. I said the amendment was not documented and there was no record of a second vote. Sharon said the minutes were corrected to reflect what actually happened at the meeting. I said if that was true, there should be a notation explaining the correction and the date it was made. Gerald asked to see the documents. I handed him the folder. He flipped through the pages and his face went pale. He looked at Sharon and asked if she amended the minutes. Sharon said she made a clerical correction because the original notes were incomplete. Gerald said amendments required board approval and there was no record of a vote to approve the correction. Sharon said it was a minor administrative change and it did not require a vote. I said the correction was not minor because it changed the outcome of the meeting and authorized a contract that benefited the HOA financially. I said the referral fee created a conflict of interest, and the tow company had been cited for improper tows by the state licensing board. I said I had filed complaints with the police and the Department of Licensing and both agencies were investigating. Sharon stood up and said this conversation is not a debate, it is a directive, and the board had the authority to enforce community standards however they saw fit. I said the board did not have the authority to alter public records or authorize tows that violated their own rules. I pulled out my phone and played the video of Sharon talking to the tow truck driver. The audio was clear. Sharon said the plate was flagged and the driver should tow on site without waiting for confirmation. The room went silent. Gerald asked Sharon if the video was accurate. Sharon said I had edited it to make her look bad. I said the metadata was embedded in the file and I would be happy to provide the original to anyone who wanted to verify it. Gerald said the board needed to discuss this in executive session. I said I wanted the discussion on the record. Gerald said that was not how executive sessions worked. Before Gerald could adjourn the meeting, another resident stood up. It was Marcus. He said he had recorded the hearing where Sharon fined him for parking his work van, and he had audio of Sharon admitting that the updated bylaws were not approved yet. He played the clip. Sharon's voice said the rules were pending board approval, but enforcement was starting immediately to set expectations. Gerald asked Marcus to send him the recording. Marcus said he already emailed it to the entire board. Another resident stood up and said Sharon had threatened to tow her car 3 times in the past month, and she paid for a guest pass every time because she was afraid of the fees. She said the guest pass cost $20, and Sharon told her it was required even though the guidelines did not mention it. She held up the receipts. Gerald said he had never heard of a guest pass requirement. Sharon said it was a pilot program she was testing to reduce congestion. Gerald said pilot programs required board approval and there was no record of a vote. The meeting spiraled. Residents started shouting questions and Gerald could not get control. Sharon stood up and said she was done being attacked and she walked out. The board called a recess and Gerald said they would reconvene in 30 minutes. I walked outside and called Officer Ramirez. I told him what happened and he said he would follow up with the tow company and request their authorization logs. When the meeting reconvened, Gerald announced that the board was suspending parking enforcement pending a full review of the policies and the towing contract. He also said the board would hire an independent auditor to review the meeting minutes and the financial records. He said any resident who was improperly towed could submit a claim for reimbursement, and the board would evaluate each case individually. Sharon was not in the room. 2 days later, I got a call from Summit Towing. The owner said he was terminating the contract with Eagle Ridge Terrace effective immediately. He said the Department of Licensing had opened an investigation and he did not want to risk his license over HOA referral fees. He also said he was refunding all tow fees from the past 6 months and sending written apologies to everyone who was towed. He said the refund checks would be mailed within 2 weeks. A week later, I got an email from Gerald. He said the board had completed the review and determined that Sharon acted outside her authority on multiple occasions. He said Sharon was removed from her position as Community Standards Chair, and the board was recommending mediation with a neutral third party to resolve the outstanding disputes. He also said the board voted to eliminate the referral fee arrangement with any future tow vendors and update the enforcement policy to require written notice and a 48-hour grace period before any tow. The following week, I got a letter in the mail. It was a written reversal from management with a real citation number and an apology for the improper tow. The letter said the HOA had updated their policies, and I would not be subject to any further parking enforcement unless I violated a clearly documented rule. The letter also said Sharon had been required to apologize on the record in front of the room at the next board meeting, and the apology would be included in the meeting minutes. I attended the meeting. Sharon read a prepared statement. She said she regretted any confusion or inconvenience her enforcement actions may have caused, and she acknowledged that she did not follow proper procedure. She said she was stepping down from the board and would no longer be involved in community standards. Her voice was flat, and she did not make eye contact with anyone. When she finished reading, Gerald thanked her and moved on to the next agenda item. After the meeting, Angela from the city clerk's office sent me an email. She said the state licensing board had issued a formal warning to Summit Towing for improper tows, and the company had agreed to implement new training and authorization protocols to protect their license. She also said the HOA agreed to mediation with a neutral third party to settle the claims from residents who were improperly towed, and the mediator would issue binding recommendations. I got my refund check 3 weeks later. It covered the full tow fee plus the storage and administrative charges. I deposited it and filed the receipt with the rest of my documents. The neighborhood was quieter after that. The new Community Standards Chair sent an email introducing herself and asking for feedback on the updated enforcement policy. I replied with a few suggestions and she thanked me for the input. Sharon moved out 2 months later. I saw the moving truck parked in front of her building and I watched from my window as she loaded boxes into the back. She did not look at anyone and she did not say goodbye. A couple on the porch across the street watched her leave like it was the final episode of the show they had been following all season. When the truck pulled away, I went back to my kitchen and made coffee. I still park in the same spot. I still take pictures with timestamps. I still keep a folder with all the documents just in case. but the tire chalk marks stopped appearing, and the tow trucks stopped circling. The HOA sent out a newsletter announcing the new enforcement policy, and the board president wrote a letter acknowledging that the previous system was flawed and promising to do better. I filed the newsletter with the rest of my records and moved on. The funny thing is, Sharon's own clip, the one I recorded of her talking to the tow driver, ended up proving the opposite of her claim that everything was authorized and above board. The timestamp in the audio made it clear she was ordering tows without proper verification, and the driver was following her instructions without checking the rules. When the board played the clip during the executive session, it became the turning point that forced them to act. Marcus sent me a message a few months later. He said he was glad someone finally pushed back and he wished he had fought harder when it happened to him. I told him it only worked because I kept records and found people like Angela who knew how the system worked. I also told him it helped that Sharon got sloppy and left a trail. If she had been more careful, it would have been harder to prove. Lisa stopped by my apartment one afternoon and brought me a plate of cookies. She said her kids could finally leave their bikes in the common area without getting a violation notice, and she appreciated that I stuck with it. I told her the win was not just mine, and everyone who spoke up at the meeting made a difference. She said she was glad the board finally listened. I still see the couple on the porch sometimes. They wave when I walk past and I wave back. We do not talk about Sharon or the towing or the meetings, but there is an understanding that we all lived through the same absurd drama and came out the other side. The neighborhood feels normal now. People park without fear. The guest passes disappeared. The enforcement is consistent and the rules are written down where everyone can read them. I learned a few things from the whole mess. First, document everything. Second, public records requests are powerful tools. Third, HOAs have authority, but they are not above the law. Fourth, standing up to petty tyrants works if you have the receipts and the patience to follow through. Fifth, allies matter, and sometimes they show up in unexpected places like a city clerk's office or a neighbor's recording. I also learned that Karen types like Sharon thrive in gray areas where rules are vague and enforcement is arbitrary. They count on people being too tired or too scared to push back. They use bureaucracy as a weapon and they escalate until you give up. But when you force them to play by their own rules and shine a light on the contradictions, they fall apart fast. The tow yard is still on Pacific Avenue. I drive past it sometimes and I think about the $305 I paid and the hours I spent fighting to get it back. It was worth it. Not just for the money, but for the principle. Sharon wanted me to feel powerless, and instead I took her playbook and used it against her. The board wanted to protect their referral fee, and instead they got audited and exposed. Summit Towing wanted easy contracts, and instead they got investigated and lost their exclusive deal. I still work nights at the warehouse. I still park in front of my building. I still keep my resident decal on the windshield even though no one checks anymore. The gray overcast light still makes everything look tense some afternoons, but now it is just weather, not a backdrop for another enforcement ambush. The motion blur background is gone, and the faces are calm. The HOA sends out reminders about community events and lawn care schedules. The new board is boring in the best way. They follow the rules, they document their votes, and they do not invent policies on the fly. The neighborhood group chat is quiet except for the occasional lost cat post or a question about trash pickup. It is what an HOA should be, a functional system that solves problems instead of creating them. Sharon's name comes up every now and then when someone tells a story about the bad old days. People laugh and shake their heads, and someone always says they cannot believe it got that crazy. I do not say much when those conversations happen. I just nod and let them talk. I know what happened, and I know how it ended, and that is enough. The final irony is that Sharon spent so much time trying to control everyone's parking that she never saw the bigger picture. She thought she was enforcing standards, but she was really just feeding her need for power. She thought she was protecting property values, but she was really just alienating residents and exposing the HOA to legal liability. She thought she was untouchable, but she was really just one records request away from losing everything. I got a message from Gerald a few months after the dust settled. He said the board appreciated my persistence, and he hoped the new policies would prevent future issues. He also said the board had established a resident advisory committee to review enforcement actions, and he asked if I wanted to join. I declined. I told him I had done my part and I was happy to let someone else take the lead. He understood. The mediation process wrapped up and the HOA agreed to eliminate the referral fee clause from all future vendor contracts. They also agreed to require written notice and photographic evidence before any enforcement action. The mediator's report was posted on the resident portal, and it became the blueprint for how the HOA operates now. Angela sent me a copy and said it was one of the cleanest outcomes she had seen in an HOA dispute. I framed the refund check, not because I needed a trophy, but because it reminded me that systems can be fixed when people refuse to accept the abuse. It hangs on my kitchen wall next to my work schedule, and every time I see it, I remember the hardware store parking lot, the tow truck driver calling dispatch on speaker, Sharon waving her remote control like it was authority, and the moment when the whole scam fell apart because the paperwork did not lie. I will see you in the next upload.